So thanks so much for joining today. Steve and I, our session would have been called Two Old White Guys Holding Forth on Some Stuff, but we decided against that and instead ask sort of about what is organizational research for and how can it matter in the world. So I'd like to start off with this question: why do we do organizational research? And I just want to warn you in advance that you will be visited by three metaphors over the course of this talk. The first one is the Winchester Mystery House. The second will be a bag of Cheetos. And the third will be the Irish elk. This will all make sense when we get to the end. So the promise of impactful research, society, accreditors, funders for academic research look to us to provide insights to guide policy and practice. And in a lot of the schools that we operate in, up to 40% of faculty time is supposed to be dedicated to research. If you add these two things up, tens of thousands of highly qualified PhDs teaching in business schools around the world, we should be able to achieve the SDGs 5 years early and under budget. We've got so much brain power doing so much research that we should be able to solve most of the world's problems quickly and efficiently, and then take a break for a PIMS. This is kind of the premise of RRBM, Responsible Research in Business and Management. You should all join right now at rrbm.network. Someone can put that in the chat. That's the sponsor of these sessions. And the premise is, how do we orient research to solving big problems, and why is it so hard to do this? This is where our first metaphor comes in. Now, this is the Winchester Mystery House. Steve Barley and I both love the Winchester Mystery House. It's in San Jose, California. And the metaphor here, so the story behind the Mystery House is that Sarah Winchester was the heiress to a giant fortune. Her husband invented the Winchester rifle and made tons of money. She was one of the richest people in the world at this time. She went to a spiritual medium who told her that she needed to build a house and continue constructing room after room, or she would be haunted by the spirits of the men who were killed by her husband's rifles. And so, according to the legend, she continued construction from 1888 until she died in 1922. Year-round, day and night, there were people working on this house. And the thing was, there wasn't an architectural plan. They just built every room separately. And every room is kind of beautiful in its own way, but it has these weird features: stairways that just stop at a ceiling, or doorways that open out onto the air, or windows that look out on a wall. The point was not to get to anything. The point was just the construction in itself. It had no other point. This is a thinly veiled metaphor for what we're about to talk about today. So point number one, do we value novelty or truth in the work that we do? And Brian Nosek and friends have written, to the extent that publishing itself is rewarded, that it is in scientists' personal interests to publish regardless of whether the published findings are true. And I think we all kind of know that's right, that we get rewarded for publications, not for truth per se. And that seems like a pretty twisted incentive system. Management may be the only field out there where every doctoral student reads Murray Davis's That's Interesting, not as a cautionary tale, but as a how-to guide. How do you write something to delight your fellow readers, rather than how do you make it correct? It's kind of hard to visualize Watson and Crick saying, we've discovered the structure of life, but what should we put in the intro? How do we get readers to really want to follow up on this discovery? How do we bait the hook for this paper? That kind of doesn't happen there. Got a fun, a real world quasi experiment that seems inspired by Murray Davis. I came across this 8 years ago. It is a set of authors drawing on public health data from Austria, and they published, same authors, same data, but two fairly different versions of what they found at the same time in February of 2014. The paper on the left concludes, our results have shown that consuming a diet rich in fruits and vegetables is associated with better health and health-related behavior. Boring. Everybody knows that. No one cares. You'll see that it has only 6 shares. But here in PLOS One, they published a spicier set of findings. Our results showed that a vegetarian diet is associated with poorer health cancer, allergies, mental health disorders, a higher need for healthcare, and poorer quality of life. Wait a minute, that's interesting. I want to know more. You could see up in the article that it was viewed 200,000 times. It was shared 660 times. Clearly, the one on the right is the winner of this contest because it's super interesting, counterintuitive, and novel. Not true, but certainly interesting. Is success measured by progress or by impact? So one concept of progress would be cumulation, that we answer important questions correctly. So what's the structure of DNA? Or how many moons does Jupiter have? Or if you raise a minimum wage, does employment go down? More or less answerable questions. That's one approach, is actually coming up with answers. An alternative that we seem to love most of all is citations, that our notion of impact is how widely are you cited. And I'm here to say that in management scholarship, Google Scholar has become the universal tool to assess impact. I read and write lots of tenure cases, and we've reached this point where it's almost obligatory, as if the committee didn't have access to the internet themselves. People will mention Google Scholar. And I am here to say, I don't normally make value judgments, but this is really, 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 really bad for 100 different reasons, but I will point to one of them. I don't know if you're familiar with this whole Google thing, but the insight of Google is that if you crawled the web and grabbed every web page and toted up every link in those web pages, you could then apply social network analysis and something that looks a lot like an eigenvector, in-degree eigenvector measure of centrality, something like that. I'm not sure. Ron's on the call, so he can clarify what this is. But PageRank essentially is social network analysis applied to the web, and it works pretty well. It works pretty well if you can crawl everywhere on the web. But when you have lots of people trying to crawl the web, websites put up security and say, no, we're not letting you in here. Universities will say, we're not sure we want you coming in and scanning all of our pages. Are you a robot? Maybe. So Google and Microsoft universally are waved in by pretty much every web domain, and that means they're the only two entities able to do what they do when it comes to sort of trawling for references. Bad news is that Microsoft Academic, which is a truly outstanding, wonderful, thoughtful, well-resourced vehicle for getting at citations and tracking things, was closed at the end of last year. So pour one out for our fallen comrade. Microsoft Academic was outstanding, but nobody had ever heard of it. They all go to Google Scholar, which is basically a side hustle for three guys on their weekend. And yet it has become the sun around which the planets orbit in academia. Probably not a good thing for us. You might think, but now we're in a world of big data, and big data means we'll finally be able to answer every question thoughtfully and well. And I'm here to tragically tell you that is not the way that this whole thing has worked out with big data. I'll just post this little quote from my article. It's like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet. Is that going to lead to good nutrition and great dietary choices? Maybe not. If novelty, statistical significance, and citability are our guides, then rather than seeing cumulative progress, we're going to see a disaster. We're going to see studies packed with highly significant, highly counterintuitive results crying out for citation, but it's not going to accumulate. Thus, we get to metaphor number 2, Cheetos. I don't know if you've ever had Cheetos. They're these weird, puffy, kind of grotesque orange snacks that have been around for 70 years. They have this fun thing that nutritionists call vanishing caloric density. So quoting here, when a food melts down quickly in the mouth, your brain interprets the food as having no calories, as if once the food has disappeared, so have the calories. And this is why you can keep eating Cheetos for a long time without feeling full. Cheetos are the opposite of food. You can eat a pound of these things and you will be filled with calories and become morbidly obese, but you won't feel full. It is the anti-food. That is also a thinly veiled metaphor for some of what our current incentive system is motivating. And I want to point out here, that what we do is really, really expensive. Some colleagues at Wharton did a study where they estimated that an A journal article, if you sort of imagine that people really do spend 40% of their time on research, that an A journal article costs about $400,000 to produce. $400,000 is a lot of money. And you might say, but we are pure intellects searching the world for knowledge and sharing truth with our acolytes. All of us in academia, especially in the organizations world, love Jim March for this quote. University is not really a market. Higher education is a vision, not a calculation. It's a commitment, not a choice. Students are not customers, they are acolytes. Teaching is not a job, it is a sacrament. Research is not an investment, it is a testament. I love self-flattery as much as the next guy, and I love this quote because I'd love to imagine myself doing sacraments and testaments and things like that. But we're living through some pretty troubled times. The financial crisis of 2008 pretty much killed off the social sciences that aren't named economic, or killed off the humanities. And COVID has largely killed off the social sciences, at least if you look at the job market. I'm not sure that we're next, but academia is under some serious pressure about having something useful to say about the world, and it takes a pretty ugly form. South Carolina legislature wants to end college tenure. Oh, I hope that doesn't spread. University system of Georgia eviscerates tenure. Oh, I hope it stops there. Proposal would weaken protections for tenure at Florida University. Oh, this is not going well. These neighboring states are having some troubles. Jump over to Texas. Well, university people talk about critical race theory, so let's eliminate tenure. We're living through some very precarious times, at least in lower North America, when it comes to things like academic freedom. We're living in a complicated time. And if we are not able to document the value of what we do by taking on problems thoughtfully in the world, I think that's going to be troublesome. And business schools are uniquely troubled because we don't get grant funding, at least in lower North America. We rely on student tuition to do what we do. And I'm not sure that what we do can go on in that way forever. So our last metaphor here is the Irish elk. Darwin commented about the Irish elk. They went extinct thousands of years ago, but their big old heads and antlers can be dug up in peat bogs in Ireland, preserved, and they have these ludicrously huge horns. And the theory around Irish elk was they didn't grow these giant antlers so that they could take on their enemies. If anything, they slow you down. Giant antlers are a not great device for self-defense. They were more like a display, probably for sexual selection, that sort of expanded for their competition with other Irish elk for mates, but did not help them during climate change or when there were predators out there. And so they grew the big display, but it left them vulnerable to extinction. So that is a third of our metaphors. I will turn it over to Mr. Steve Barley for the rebuttal.
All right, let me see if I can get my slides up here. Let's see. How do I kill these notes? Can you guys see only the slides, or can you see something down the left side?
Dr. Barley, you have
Yes.
to share, you have to open the presentation mode before sharing, and then sharing the presentation mode, not the PowerPoint thing.
Okay, let me try that, see how that works. So I have to share before I open it. I'm not sure I follow you.
No, I think you do what you've done, and then just click on the presentation mode.
Okay, and where do I get presentation mode?
So if you put it up, oh, that's it. There you go.
Okay, you're fine. You can see that.
Cool. Yeah, excellent.
Okay, so let me try to give a little historical setting for what we're doing here this morning, right? So Jerry was the editor of ASQ back in 2015. Before that, and maybe a little after that too, but this happened to correspond with the 60th anniversary of the Administrative Science Quarterly. So Jerry wrote this essay that he just talked about, and then he asked me and Carl Wyke, and I don't know whether anyone else, to also Bill Starbuck, to also write essays cued off of his essay. And so both of us today are talking about the ideas that we put forth in these, I might call them, well, essays or commentaries or whatever you want to call them. So anyway, today what I would like to talk about is my notions about why we have this mystery house, and perhaps end up by talking about is there some ways out of the mystery house. But to begin with, what I would like to do is point to the three claims that motivate my comments for today. And I say these are claims, these are my perceptions of the way the field is currently structured and the way people are currently rewarded. So like Jerry, I believe that we've come to value novel, interesting, and counterintuitive findings or theories or frames over the accretion of cumulative insight and, more importantly, from my perspective, empirical contributions. Our reward system, secondly, our reward system is largely responsible for an undue emphasis on novelty and impact, which then in turn creates a quest among researchers for citations and making theoretical contributions that wow everyone, rather than plodding towards knowledge. And I think that research is often applaud. To move beyond impact, therefore, we need to begin to seek answers to important questions, like Jerry talked about at the end of his talk, and study important problems. For me, that means particularly the way that organizations affect society, but other people have different definitions for what constitutes an important question, what constitutes an important phenomenon. Now, I think I should tell you, make a couple caveats and boundary conditions for what I'm about to say. My thoughts are shaped by the fact that my entire career has been lived out in an American R1 university, different R1 universities, but still research universities. Secondly, I work as an ethnographer, an empiricist, and a sociologist. So my perspective on this is going to reflect these things in ways that I may not be fully aware of. And finally, I should say that I've never really taught in a business school. So in my world, you do have to get grants. You don't get money given to you. So anyway, with that said, there are two ways in my mind to pursue a research career. And rather than give them names, I'm just going to call them path one and path two. In path one, what you do is you select an important, meaty problem or phenomenon. Based on that, you develop and execute a convincing research design. Convincing meaning that this design is going to really help you answer this question or explore this phenomenon in ways that are deep and valid. Therefore, what you're aiming for is the quality of the contribution and not the quantity of your contributions. And what we're really shooting for are accurate empirical generalizations or contributions. In path two, having a career, what you really want to do is always publish in the highest ranked journals possible. You're going to settle for relatively easily executed research designs. And as an ethnographer, I see lots of these. They're marked by, in my mind, very few informants and reliance almost entirely on interview data. I realize interview data is great, is one of the only ways to get at meaning, but a failure to do observations of behavior as an ethnographer means that you're really not, you don't learn very much about daily life in the social setting that you're attempting to purvey. Thirdly, we're going to aim for quantity. The more publications, the better, because it's going to set us up for tenure. And finally, we're going to emphasize theoretical contributions. And you hear people talking about this all the time with the verb theorize. Right? I'm having trouble theorizing my data. Can you help? This came from a conference where that was said by almost every person there. My concerns are that the second path contributes to an ever-growing number of papers that seek novelty over empirical contributions. It's easier because it's easier to evaluate careers that follow path 2, and by easier to evaluate, I mean by tenure committees. The emphasis is placed on journal reputation, papers per year, citation counts. As Jerry points out, it's as if these committees cannot Google a person's scholarship to begin with. You have to have this pointed out to you in letters that reviewers have written. Reviewers, when you send a journal in, at least in my experience, have over time come to focus more on the theoretical contributions than on the empirics. When I was starting out, I used to get reviewers who would tell me things about how I could improve my analysis, or there was a flaw in my research design, or can you do an additional analysis to triangulate onto the claim you're making? I haven't gotten those kinds of reviews back in years. Almost now, all the reviews I get back focus on the front end of the paper and whether or not my framing of the paper is the optimal framing for the data. And I always wonder, how will a reviewer know what is the optimal framing for an ethnographic set of data? Because they don't have the data. But at any rate, that's what I get. As a result, I think young scholars learn to work in ways that they, and we being larger field, believe lead to success primarily by path 2. Unsurprisingly then, more young researchers think that following path 2 is the best way to success. But path 2's objective metrics of impact are an example of what Stephen Kerr called in his famous 1975 paper, A Folly of Rewarding A while hoping for B. The folly is that being prolific in high status outlets is equivalent to making significant contributions to knowledge. I think, let me kind of explore this folly in a little more depth. So what I've diagrammed here is folly, what I'm going to call folly 1. It has the status of a hypothesis. This actually could be tested if you wanted to do it, I think. But there's some givens here. And the givens are that, first off, all journals have limited space. ASQ currently publishes about 7 to 9 papers per issue. There are 4 issues per year. So 7 times 9 is all the space they've got. That's assumption 1. All journals are like this. Second, most authors, or many authors that I know, say that what they do is the first thing they do with the paper is they send it to the highest tier journal that they can think of. And then if it doesn't get in, they move down the hierarchy. Thirdly, over the years, the number of potential authors have grown significantly. When I was coming out of graduate school in the early 80s, the Academy of Management had about 8,000 members. Today it has 18,000 members. And finally, over time, what's happened, at least in my experience, is that papers that are submitted to journals get asked for more revisions before they're either accepted then rejected than they were 30 years ago. The outcomes of this kind of situation or these conditions is that, first off, journals receive and therefore reject more papers. Because people are sending everyone is sending there's lots of people sending their papers to top tier journals. And because these top tier journals ask for more revisions before making a serious decision, it takes longer to publish any particular paper, even if you're successful. This means in the end that unless authors are extremely prolific, they're going to have fewer papers published per unit time. Meanwhile, over the years, more journals have been founded in the field of management and even in the field of organization studies and theory. In fact, this past month, I've seen 2 announcements for 2 new journals. As journals proliferate, readers become overloaded. They can't possibly read all of this material. So most papers get less attention than they may have in the past when there were fewer papers and people could keep up with it. That should mean, empirically speaking, that the average citation per paper should have fallen over time. So that's folly number 1. This is how why you reward for A while hoping what you're really going to get is B. And what they're rewarding for is papers that emphasize novelty and maybe make minor contributions. Folly number 2 is also hypothesis. I don't believe this as much as I believe the one I just showed you, but I thought I'd put it up here, right? When reviewers emphasize novel theoretical contributions, the audience responds or researchers responds, and they began to demand more novelty of themselves, which means that researchers are paying less attention to research questions, sound designs, and empirical evidence, and more attention to finding the right storyline that'll get their paper past the reviewers and into publication. This should indirectly lead to less cumulative knowledge because everyone needs to be novel. And over time, what this means is that the social sciences come to more and more to resemble the humanities, where there the emphasis has long been placed on novel contributions and clever analyses. So how do we get back to path 1? I think there are 2 approaches that we could take. And I would say that being a sociologist, we're talking about changing an institution. And I do not think this is easy. So I know the kinds of things I'm saying will sound Pollyanna-ish in some ways to some folks, even to me. But nevertheless, there are only 2 ways that I can think about doing this. The first is to engage in some kind of institutional action designed to change the institutions of publishing that have emerged over the last 45 to 50 years. How do you do this? I think that to really make a hit, there needs to top schools, which are emulated by other schools, need to get together, build a coalition, and to begin to reject path 2 thinking. They need to really understand why we are started to reward A, and when we hope what we're really getting is B, and find ways around that. One way to do this would be to really emphasize peer evaluations of the empirical soundness and contribution and substantive contributions of a journal paper. This is presumably what reviewers on tenure cases are supposed to do. But as Jerry's pointed out, it's hard to find a letter anymore these days that doesn't somewhere along the line mention the number of citations you've gotten, the number of papers you published, and how many of them appeared in a journal. Not as much about the substantive contribution that you may or may not have made, right, to the field. Thirdly, I think we should begin to encourage scholars to study important problems that confront society and better yet, organizations and better yet society. This is what the Responsible Research Network is attempting to try to do. And finally, I think we could begin to broaden or eliminate even our list of A publications. Every school has about in organization studies anyway, has about 5 or 6 top tier publications that everybody agrees are top tier publications. But note that these are generalist journals. These are not specialist journals. Why not include specialist journals in your top tier publications? The reason being that putting a paper in a generalist journal is harder because you have to appeal to a broader set of invisible colleges than you do in a specialist journal. The second major approach is individual action. The individual, you as a scholar, can choose that you're going to place your bets on studying important phenomena, developing a strong research design that will increase the odds of being able to make a strong contribution, seeking, if you're an ethnographer, thick and convincing data, be willing to focus what you have to say on those members of your invisible college, the people who are studying the same things you're studying. And if you're lucky, then, or you're really good at writing, then maybe you'll draw some people in, but it's that invisible college you really want to speak to, because that's where advance in knowledge presumably takes place. And then shoot for fewer but better publications. I like to think that this is what I've tried to do over my career, because I've never been able to be an extremely productive guy. I can really only do one thing at a time. So anyway, that's what I have to say. And in ending, what I would pose to you guys for our discussion, some questions, right? First off, does anything that Jerry and I have had to say ring true to your own experience? Secondly, are the developments that concern Jerry and me primarily in North American disease? And finally, what are your ideas for how we might exit this mystery house that Jerry has defined for us? So that's me. I'm done.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jerry. What we'll do now, we'll just open up for conversation. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and start speaking. That would be fine as well. But whilst people are processing what Jerry and Steve said so far, perhaps I could just start with 1 or 2 questions, if that's okay. Jerry, maybe the first question is to you, because you touched on the Davis paper. That's interesting, and the title of this conversation is that's useful. So it's almost being juxtaposed to that paper. What do we do with that's interesting? If we move towards more what we call useful research, what shall we do with it that's interesting?
It feels to me that a discussion that we really ought to be having, but largely don't, is who is this research for? Not even what is it for, or why do we do it exactly, but who is supposed to benefit, if anyone, from this work? If that's interesting as a guide to action, then implicitly the constituency that matters is readers, that you are writing for readers. So what we do with our research is come up with a wild, counterintuitive, thrilling introduction, a crazy thing like, I'm going to be visited by 3 metaphors. Tell me more. It's like Dickens, like something that sort of is intended to draw readers in, but that's sort of Cheeto thinking. That assumes that the purpose of our writing is to delight readers and to get them to nod and say, wow, that's pretty great. What a lovely metaphor. And that's a pretty different motivation than how to be useful. So imagine that the intended beneficiaries of your work were the people of Flint who are sick of their water having lead in it. They don't trust local bureaucrats and they don't really trust universities, but we really need to come up with some sensible way to get healthy water into the homes of the people of Flint. Here's what my findings show about the politics around that. That would read like a pretty different paper than an interesting paper. The goal is not to be interesting. And as you know, as I think Steve is right, that so much of the effort of reviewers is, here's how to frame the paper. It's like, did Crick and Watson say, how do we frame this whole DNA thing? Like that would be insane. we've discovered that this drug has the following effects, but how do we make it counterintuitive? That would be moronic. So I think that figuring out who is this stuff for is the sort of initial question, and we want to work backwards from there. I think we're at a moment where the demands increasingly are for our work to inform sort of reimagining capitalism. So I think Steve might go along with this, but we need to understand, what are the sources of corporate power? What are the new forms of corporate organization? And really, how do we come up with a set of rules to tame these things so that they behave themselves? And so maybe that's policymakers, maybe that's the broad public, but it's not to amuse other readers. Like, amusement probably should not be our highest value. So.
Thank you, Jerry. Just want to remind everyone, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, the virtual hand. I can see there's a question in the chat from Consuelo Alcoas. But if readers of journals are almost all academics, what are the chances that the practical implications of a paper might actually be used by practitioners in real life?
Go for it, Steve.
Well, you're certainly right in that most practitioners are not going to read our journals, right? Having said that, you need to ask, who are the practitioners you're writing for, right? So are you writing for managers? Are you writing for policymakers? Are you writing for another potential audience? Are you writing to help people who are working on climate change or whatever, right? Most practicing engineers don't read engineering journals either. Scientists do read science journals, but engineers don't. Yet this knowledge filters out to engineers. And I think that the knowledge that we create also filters out too, not because people read our journals, but because that information gets transferred to them through other through other media. For example, what we say to people in a classroom. What we do, right, at least when I teach, what I do is I'll take a topic and I'll read a bunch of stuff on it and I'll synthesize it down and I'll try to present to my students what it is I think I've learned. And I will emphasize points or that I think are really important and that they ought to know about. And so what I'm doing is I'm filtering that literature on a particular kind of problem for them, right? So that I give them what I think is most useful. Now, I could be wrong about what's most useful, but that's what I'm trying to do. And I think most academics do that. It's also the case that, if you make a reputation for yourself in a line of inquiry, you will be known among members of your visible college. And when policymakers put together bodies to advise them on that area of policy, they will call on people from that invisible college. So I've had I don't think I write for policymakers, particularly in the area of employment relations, but I have been put on committees because members of my invisible college have been asked to nominate people for those committees. And at that point, you do begin to have more direct impact. So that's kind of my answer off the top of my head.
Yeah, it feels like it's pretty, like influencing practice through journals feels like it's not going to work. I would say if you think of your audience as business people, then you'll probably never have any influence because we have pretty weird incentives here. In the world of public health or medicine, people that want to take some action love to cite authorities that prove masks work, or this medicine works, or this procedure works, or here's what we know about infectious diseases, and they cite research for it. Nobody in business cites research as the reason why they took their decision. Why did you decide to have your board elected every year instead of every 3 years? They don't point to event studies. It's because activist investors force us to. And so even if the work is rooted in research, imagine you're at a consulting firm, let's call it McKay, to hide who they might be through a shield of anonymity, are they going to cite a bunch of academic research for whatever it is that they want to tell you to do, or say the McKay Global Institute has uncovered blah, blah, blah? So there's almost strong incentives not to cite back to business research to explain the actions that people do in business. In policy, that could be better. As Steve was mentioning, if you want to be sort of testified before Congress about what happens if we limit acquisitions by all tech companies with over $100 billion market cap, which is the execrable Josh Hawley's idea about, how to limit big tech. Well, that's one we're going to edit out, just to be clear. So someone that doesn't know what an API is thinks they can regulate big tech. But anyway, this is one of those cases where you might be called on as an expert to explain things. And so policymakers could prefer to have things rooted in academic research. But I don't think that we should be writing for working managers, because it's just not going to work. At least the kind of work that we do is not going to make a difference. If you say be nice to your employees, that might make a difference, but I don't think research to immediate managerial practice by, actual folks supervising human beings, I don't think that's really what we're good at. I think we can think more about sort of policy, but getting it out to the world is tricky. We managers aren't readers, and I think that's probably not our audience. But there is a broader way that you can lay the context out to explain some phenomenon out there. So I saw that the ever brilliant Bob Eberhardt is on this call. He has a paper with a wonderful co-author also on the call about entrepreneurship and the rhetoric of entrepreneurship, and how this sort of terminology is shaping the way. Wait, Steve, do you want to say something about this paper? Because it's so good. It's like, this is something where it's not, here's an immediate action, but here's the way we ought to think about this problem.
You're doing a great job. Keep going, Sherry.
But how the rhetoric of entrepreneurship is sort of pervading society in a way that shapes how we educate people and how self-employed people think of themselves. It's like, well, that can change the way you think about things. If not guiding a specific action, it can give you a framework to understand some phenomena that we're seeing in society. So.
Whilst on this topic, Jerry and Steve, you both written not only academic papers, peer-reviewed scholarly papers, but also published books. How do you combine, so there's almost like two different worlds, if you like, because your books seem to be written more for, not for the academics themselves so much, at least my impression.
Well, I can only speak for myself. I'm not consciously writing when I write a book. First off, I guess there's some things to say about a book. I actually think books are very important. And if I'm more likely to read books than I am journal papers, but this may be just because I was trained as an English major and I did, a liberal arts degree and so on and so forth. But I think books are important because they give an author time and the space to really explore a phenomenon, a topic, an idea in greater depth than you ever have in a journal paper. It also frees you up to write in a less stilted manner. Journals have, journal publications have their genre, as just like a poem, right? I mean, just like a sonnet has a structure, so a journal paper has a structure, right? And there's also, and that structure moves all the way down to how you construct sentences and how you construct paragraphs. In a book, you're not constrained in that way. So what you can do with books is try to write in a way, in a language that communicates more clearly to a more general reader. So perhaps that's why you might say that my books are attempting to speak to a non-academic audience, which is not totally true. I'm hoping to speak to an academic audience as well, but I'm not constrained to write in a way that the journal articles constrain you to do. Jerry, what do you want to say about books?
I agree with everything Steve said. They're super fun. Also, you can cut loose a bit. You can go into more detail on some things, and just trying to write for the real world is hard. Like trying to say eigenvector centrality in a way that normal people will get, that's a real challenge, but I think it's a good discipline to try to do that. I mean, nobody reads books and nobody buys books, but the act of writing one turns out to be fun. It's like revisiting your dissertation every couple of years.
Thank you. We have a couple of hands raised so far. So I think Mariuszka was first.
Thank you, Ibrat, and thank you so much, both. So I have a couple of frustrations, and maybe I'll just speak them and see what you have to say back. But one is what I hear from senior scholars often, which seems to be the dominant discourse, and that's one, be generous to the existing conversation, and two, wait till tenure before taking on more challenging research. Now, both of those seem sound, but I also read into that, don't rock the boat and play it safe. And then this coupled with make an original, with an emphasis on making an original contribution to knowledge at the exclusion of replication studies, which again seems like don't challenge any past errors that might have occurred. And then so those are the things that I hear as the dominant discourse, that it's frustrating. And then another idea that I wonder, maybe this is already out there, but if there was a replication journal for young scholars, you know, to develop their skills and also turn rigor back on itself in the academy. Thank you.
There were a lot of questions there. I heard about 3 or 4, so I'm going to only address one, right? And that's the question that I heard about playing it safe until you got tenure. You know, frankly, I don't think I know anyone who's made an impact, in my mind, a serious impact on our field by playing it safe. They may play within certain rules about evidence, rules about research design, rules about being clear on what the limitations of your work are, and so on and so forth. Paying attention to what other people have said before you, not so that you don't challenge it, right? But so that you build on it. But I can't think of anyone who's had a significant impact in the thinking of our field, and there's several of these people on this call now who made it by playing safe. And I know Woody's on the call, and so Woody, please forgive me for what I'm about to say. If you don't like this, you can just turn your sound on and, you know, tell me, you know, go do something to myself. You know, when Woody and Paul DiMaggio wrote that 83 paper, it was initially rejected. I forget what journal it was rejected from, but it was a pretty substantial journal. And that paper, the reason that paper was rejected was because it was I guess, out of line with what the field was about at that point in time. And I know from speaking to Mark Granovetter that Mark had the same kind of experience when he tried to publish his Strength of Weak Ties paper, because it was so different than what everybody else did. And somehow, and it flew into the, contradicted the dominant thinking at the time. So I don't think anybody does the field any good, or themselves really any good, by playing it safe. Because if you play it safe until you're you've got tenure, you may not know how to do anything else but play it safe. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
That feels right to me. I would also sort of make the observation that elderly white guys who are journal editors and have done okay in the field might not be the best source of insight about overturning the status quo or sort of pathways to success. So a lot of us are going to say, why, when I was your age, I did the following trades. Like when Steve was your age, he was writing articles about funeral homes and the Grateful Dead that were one of the wildest. I think it was your second year paper. It's like, wow, that is one of the wildest papers I have ever seen. This is really fun. I can't believe you can get away with writing these things and publishing it. So you're talking to a couple of people who have gotten away with a lot of crazy stuff for a long time. So I'm not sure you should believe our advice. It's probably better to ask your peers, because like just the world changes in crazy, there are many fields that I would advise people against going into a doctoral program today that 30 years ago, it might've made perfect sense, but now I'd say, no, unless you got a trust fund, that's not a good bet. So I think it's good to have a reality check from people who are a little bit more plugged into the youth culture. Steve also doesn't know what TikTok is. And so we might be a little bit vintage.
If I may just jump in, I mean, if whilst on this topic of playing safe, I mean, what would it look like not to play safe? What would you do? How radical would you go? How would you go about it?
To be safe?
No, unsafe. If you go the opposite of not playing safe.
Well, I guess part of not playing it safe is what topics are you studying, right? What problems are you studying? That's part of it. That's one way to not play it safe. Another way to play it less safe is to, I mean, Jerry's right, when I was a kid, right? When I was a kid, ethnography was not widely done. And, I made a choice to become an ethnographer. Now I did that because I resonated with being able to go out and, see what people do day in and day out. It seemed like to me a much more interesting or fulfilling way to do research than to design experiments, because I'm not cut out to design experiments. I would have probably wound up being a carpenter if I had to do that all my life. But that was not done, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways, I think, not to play it safe. Jerry, what do you have to say?
I'd say one indicator for whether you're playing it safe or not is how much prologue do you have to give when you give your talk before people can understand what you're talking about. So if you can walk in and immediately say, I'm doing study on the following topic, here's my results, and people get it, you're probably doing normal science. If there's sort of enough consensus out there that people instantly get, if you say, I'm using leader-member exchange to explain fissures in groups, and I don't know. There's a lot of topics where people get it instantly when you tell them what you're up to. A lot of Steve's stuff, I'm like, it's going to take me a few minutes for me to sort of get up to speed to even know what's the interesting thing here, because this is a complicated problem. So this will sound insane, but when I was giving my job talks 32-ish years ago, I had to explain what a hostile takeover was, and I had to give a whole lot of prologue about finance and financialization, because it just wasn't normal at that time. And so it felt like, oh, that's pretty weird. For you to know why you should find this interesting, you have to have a really long background. And that's the thing about Murray Davis. If everybody knows what the consensus is, it's pretty easy to say, aha, but the opposite is true. Refrigerators make things warm, or I don't know. So, but you know, some work you have to sort of dig into it to explain what is the connection here. I guess the flip side of this is, if you say I'm going to study big important problems, I'm going to study poverty. That shouldn't be enough to get you into a journal. You should actually have something useful to say. So taking on an important problem isn't the same thing as actually having something insightful, research-based to say about it. So picking the right problem alone is not going to be enough. You have to also execute rigorously with work that stands up to scrutiny.
Thank you. Madeline, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks. I feel like nervous to ask questions to two academic rock stars that I've looked up to so long, and so many people in this room, but you know, you got to seize the moment. And you know, thank you so much for this talk and for pushing the field and for us to reflect about all of this, because I feel like the novelty and counterintuitive, how many times have we all been asked that about our work? So it feels really relevant. But I guess the question I have as I think about, you know, what you're doing when you're reviewing papers, when you're seeing this data, people's data, and this theory, because they're trying to make a theoretical contribution, they're trying to theorize, as you said, Steve. And you see this big disconnect because the data doesn't seem to be telling the story that they're telling. And, you know, what do we do with that? But I guess the bigger question to that is, what in this new pathway, if we got rid of this novelty part, what is the role of theory? Because part of all of this story is that you're trying to tell make the theoretical contribution and get it closer and closer to your data. But I found value in theory. I found it pushed me further and helped me understand my empirics better. But what is the role of theory? Like, you know what I mean? Like how you just said, Jerry, you can't just pick an important problem. You have to have something important to say. Is that just empirics? Where do you think theory comes into this, if we were to get away from the novelty counterintuitive element?
I mean, you do need a framework. If we imagine that things can accumulate, then you really do need a framework that holds the whole mess together. You need to look like, you need a map to know where's the kitchen and you know, where's the dining room. And so having some form of framework, whether we call it a theory or not, but you do need to have some mechanism or some vehicle that helps you categorize and put together the findings and insights so that it adds up in some sense. So I'm a big fan of cumulation. The reason why I love the Winchester Mystery House is it doesn't cumulate. It purposely doesn't add up to something. It's like the whole point is, well, we get paid to construct stuff, so we're putting on another room. It has no use. It's going to be weird. It's going to cost a bunch of money, but it's not really going to serve any purpose. No one's ever going to set foot in it. That's kind of where we are now. So in some sense, you know, that is the opposite of having an architect or some kind of plan. You could imagine, I got a plan for a cathedral. I have a broad set of ideas about, you know, the Gaudi Cathedral, what this thing is going to end up looking like, but you're going to have to specify the details. I don't know how this is going to fill out. And I think for us, I feel that in the world of organization theory and strategy, the most pressing problems right now are coming up with a better ontology for organizations and the organization of the economy, and coming up with a set of thoughtful rules such that if people pursue their own self-interests in the context of these rules, it's going to make the rest of us better off. So we have gone from a world where most of the economy operated through identifiable corporations that had actual physical offices with people showing up in them. And we're now living in this somewhat different world. We don't really have a good map of the way that world works. So that's job one, is come up with, you know, a theory or a vocabulary to talk about that world and the way that it's organized. And once you know some of the regularities, some of the stylized facts, then we might start asking, how do we create a set of rules so that operating in this economy will make society better off rather than worse off? That sounds a bit abstract, but just think about 1900 when most people in the industrial, what is today the industrialized world, lived on farms, didn't have paid jobs. They did work, but they didn't have sort of paychecks at bosses. And suddenly we had these things called corporations that were increasingly dominating the economy. We had to stumble our way through an understanding of what is a corporation? What is a bureaucracy? You know, we had Frederick Taylor and Weber coming up with some understandings of the way those things worked. Once you come up with those understandings, then you can say, well, how do we guide these things? How do we set up a set of rules so that when they do what they do, it makes us better off rather than worse off? I think we've reached the end of that stage. The rules that we created for that economy just don't work anyway. And Madeline, as I know you had to sit through my sad talk yesterday, I think that the antitrust narrative that it has a whole lot of fans these days completely gets it wrong. Like as I put it, it's like they want to fix the carburetor on a Tesla. Like they've just got the wrong diagnosis and the wrong map of the way that the economy works. And so they're giving advice that's not going to add up. So theory, you know, at a first glance is how do we come up with a map of this world that we're operating in? Just really good descriptives, counting the right things and coming up with the right contours. And then if we imagine that our job is come up with rules to make that system behave itself, you know, to overcome precarity, poverty, the things that we're living through now, that would seem like a pretty good agenda to us. And if it counts as counterintuitive or a theoretical contribution, I kind of don't care. I just want to get this part right because we are going through a pretty traumatic transition that could end very badly if smart people aren't working on it. All right, Steve, sorry for going off on a rant there.
Not a problem, Jerry. That's what, you know, we're both known for occasionally doing rants. I guess what I would say to you, Madeline, is that remember, one of the things I said that you need to filter everything I say through is that I think like a sociologist, right? So if I was a psychologist, I might give you a very different kind of answer because I think that in their areas of psychology, there are in fact much more cumulative knowledge. I think that individuals as physical psychological beings are more stable than social systems. Social systems change through time. So Jerry and I kind of think more like sociologists, right? So as Jerry points out, the first, if your phenomenon is changing, right, and your old categories aren't working, then you need some new categories. And that's where I would think as a scientist you start. I mean, most of the natural sciences did start in naturalism of one form or another, where the primary agenda was to categorize, right, and figure out what your categories were. But say you got the right categories, then I think theory is about trying to answer the question, why does this happen and how does it happen? And maybe more of the how does it happen than why does it happen, right? Which is probably more of an engineering approach than a science approach, because you know the big differences between science and engineering, even though the two are related, is that scientists always want to know why, right? What, and the engineers want to know how does it work, how does it work, how does it work, right? So for me, right, how does it work is part of what I expect out of a theory. And so I'm going to need a frame that's going to allow me to encapsulate my data and explain my data in ways that are consistent with the relationships in between, for lack of a better word, I wouldn't normally use this word, but I can't think of another, between the indicators of the various concepts or variables that you're working with, even in an ethnography. So sometimes I think the problem with theory in qualitative research is that the researcher hasn't gone deep enough into the phenomena that they're talking about in order to have a reason, in order to actually see how a particular frame either emerges out of the data, or you can pull the frame in and apply it to the data without it seeming like what you're trying to do is ram a square peg into a circular hole. I don't do a lot of quantitative research, so I don't know whether people who do that suffer from, see their problems in the same way, but with qualitative research, that's the way I see it. And that's what I think a theory is good for, helping you explain how something happens and maybe why it happens.
Azrin has been so patient.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barley and Davis, for sharing your insights. We often notice that the practitioners and academicians often use different sets of vocabularies to discuss or define a context. And I was wondering that, could there be a way to convert the different sets of those vocabularies? For example, when we discuss about how and why is in a theory building, as a researcher, we might be more interested in how or why a construct is useful in a research context. But a manager might be asking that, okay, I understand how and why it works, but what is there for me? Or if I want this, like the outcome, then how and why this construct work? So how do we convert these different vocabularies?
That's a tough one. I don't know. So I've tried to explain sort of constructs and indicators in the world of management, and I sometimes have some tricks. I have found that metaphors can work really well if you can explain things that way, as a sort of as a vehicle to translate from something that they already know to something that they don't know. But I'm not sure that, I don't think that's getting at your question. Maybe
Yes, it's related because we need to balance when we are introducing something new, or in case of innovation, we need to balance what is already there, and based on what is there, what can be achieved by using what is already there. But the difficult part for me is to balance what is there and what can be there. So how do we convert these two extreme or two different levels of understanding?
Well, I don't know whether this is an answer to your question, but like back in the dark ages, I took a course on educational psychology. And I don't remember a lot from this course, but the one thing that I remember, two concepts. One, the concept of a subsumer, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute. And the second, the concept of plus one-ing, and I'll tell you what the two are. So a subsumer is a concept that you have to understand in order to be able to make the step to the next concept or the next proposition, right? So you've got to really think about the order in which you're going to present ideas to people. Almost said students, but actually we're all students in one way or another, right? To people, so that you can bring them along. And secondly, plus one-ing is a similar idea, where when you present an idea or you teach a concept, you don't want to start off so far ahead of where the person is at this point in time that they can't bridge from where they are to where you want to take them. And so they fall off. That's plus one. So what you're trying to do is not plus two, not plus three, not plus four, but only plus one. Now, I don't know whether that helps. And the reason this may not help is because, frankly, I've never tried to talk to managers, and I don't have to because I teach. First, I taught in a labor school. It's much easier for me to teach to union guys. And secondly, then I worked in engineer school, and I don't really have to talk to managers there either. I just have to teach guys who want to be project managers.
There was a question that shot by, and I wanted to make sure that we got to it, which is Nicole's question. Where do you see the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this new world with new rules? I think that's like the perfect kind of question to think about how we go wrong in some of our status quo research. So this question is great because in answering it, you'd say, well, for bureaucracies, we had an understanding of what we might do. You can test. You could be like Frank Dobbin and his co-authors and say, we tried 1,000 different programs. This works and this doesn't. If your goal is fair promotions, this is the right thing to implement. If your goal is representation of people at higher levels of management. These are the things that work there. So we've got a pretty good map of the way that bureaucracies with career ladders work, and we have a sense of how to make interventions work in that world. Now imagine you switch to a world where half the people or more are contractors, and they get their jobs through personal contacts, as Mark Granovetter might suggest, or through horrifying AI bots that have replaced human beings as interviewers. We finally trained all the HR people in implicit bias, and now we're using horrifying AI programs to evaluate people. And if you don't look like they think you should look according to their testing data, then you don't make it past that first screening. So now we've got entire new avenues for racism and bias to sneak into the way that we're hiring people. We've got programs in place for old bureaucracies, but now we're living in a world where you're never going to show up at an office and you get hired by a bot by recording an interview and trying to, maintain eye contact and make sure that you display the right emotions. So it feels like this is, so Nicole's question is like exactly the right one. The old answers are not going to work for the world that our students, our undergraduate students, are now entering, where jobs are short-term, you work on projects, and employment is allocated basically through bots. I don't know if you've been out there in the world. This is why Steve and I might not be the best witnesses for this. Like people under 22, all their job interviews are with phones and computer screens and not with human beings. It's kind of a nightmarish Black Mirror scenario playing out with our own kids and students right now. So how do you build a DEI agenda into a world of shorter term or project-based employment where jobs don't go through sort of the traditional channels? So it feels like that's a good dissertation. I want to read papers about that. Like how do people navigate this world of precarious employment, and how is it that biases or equity or and inclusion might play out in that kind of a context? So just want to make sure that question got at least an airing. We have another questioner. Hi, Inui.
Hi, Jerry. Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for today's discussion. I wasn't planning on asking a question, but then there's just been so many threads throughout this conversation that I was like, okay, let me just go for it. And I think it goes back in some ways to the incentive structures you were speaking about earlier on, in terms of what is incentivized in academic research in the social sciences, and in particular in organizations and management research. And you touched on the notion of, or the distinction of publishing multiple papers versus, or many, quantity over perhaps quality, and that being driven by that need to be published in a journal. And the reason of, behind all of that is this notion of tenure. And I actually wondered, because when you come into academia, particularly if you come from industry, you hear tenure all the time as the reason for doing things and the reason for not doing things. And I almost wondered to a certain degree, because tenure sounds like this magical thing, right? Like job security in one way. But there should also be, I think, other reasons that people are perhaps aspiring to tenure. And I wondered if maybe you could speak a little bit to what is it that tenure is intended to protect as it relates to the work that we do. And yeah, maybe perhaps a little riff on that, I think would be quite useful.
Yeah, Inui, I'll take that one. This is because I get to be really idealistic here, right? The reason I think tenure is important is not just because you get security of employment, although I do think that's really nice, right? The reason security of employment in academia and tenure is important, right, is because it protects what you can say, right? It shields you from being hunted down for your ideas and killed. Right? Now, you may think that I'm joking here, but the last 4 slides, I think there were 4 slides that Jerry put up, right, about what's going on in Texas, what's going on in Florida, what's, he confined it to the southern states, but I think that this actually also happened like a couple of years ago, didn't it, Jerry, in Colorado? There was a guy in Wisconsin. It's not just the southern states, it's all over the place, right? Tenure is designed, well, let's put it this way. Sometimes I think universities are minimally secure prisons for people who would otherwise cause a lot of trouble for society. And so they put us in these minimally secure prisons and give us tenure, right? So that we can't really raise too much hell, right? Now, if they go after tenure, we don't even have that. So that's why I think you want tenure. I think you want tenure so that you can take your lines of inquiry in whatever direction you want without having someone say you're not engaged in right thinking, and therefore goodbye to you, right? And I can guarantee you there are guys in Texas who want to do this. And not just in Texas.
I mean, it is shopping season to hire faculty that are teaching in Texas and South Carolina. If you're at a university and you've got some slots, let me tell you, I can point to some states where there's some outstanding faculty that would be delighted to leave their misogynist, gun-toting. Oh, wait a minute, are we taping this? Sorry. I think there's a lot of opportunities for those looking to find some high quality, well-published faculty in some prestigious institutions that are doing some surprising things. Let's say that. Ibrat, can we get John Demschauer to ask his latest question? So John, you had a bunch of questions there, and they're all cool. And the last one on climate change seemed a positive discussion.
Yes, my question was that climate change is challenging organizations, but how can we change the corporate reality? But how can change and the corporate reality be reframed to fit the reality of climate change, right? And all research is based on the body of knowledge. It's retrospective. And can that kind of knowledge actually contribute to solutions in the current situation, or is that kind of theoretical and research-based knowledge actually obsolete in that situation? Do we in fact need design and design thinking in that situation, a new beginning? Because I think something actually what is happening now for organizations all over the world is actually that we somehow have to reframe the whole logic of being a business corporation, right? So what would your answers or ideas in relation to that question be?
This is the kind of thing that keeps me awake every night forever. So we've got this we've got this Hummer that is running on 10 gallons per mile. Going forward, and the car is moving, and anything we're going to do, some people are going to get pitched out the back of the truck, and it's going to be very complicated, and yet we're heading for a cliff. So, as you know, I love metaphors. Like, how do we halt this thing from heading for a cliff? It does feel that the central actors that most need change are a relative handful of corporations. There's a relative handful of major corporations that are distinctly responsible for much of our current dilemma. And we do have some thoughts about how you make interventions with them. I mean, I guess part of what we can do as researchers is say, what are, think like an acupuncturist, like what are the points that give us the most leverage, the most capacity to change their behavior? So last year, something startling happened. Exxon got delisted from the Dow Jones Index, which I never thought I would see. But also a hedge fund, a do-gooder hedge fund called Engine Number One ran 4 candidates for the Exxon board of directors, which is always a giant fool's errand that will never work. But they got BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard to vote with them. And they basically fired 3 Exxon directors and replaced them with their 3 nominees. And that is like the Berlin Wall going down in the corporate world. That shows that there are some pressure points where, with the right actors lined up in the right way. This is like Steve's OMT paper, when he got the OMT award about politics. Like, we might have some really thoughtful, interesting things to say about what are the vehicles we can use to apply pressure and to change that relatively small number of corporations to behave themselves, because they will not do it of their own accord. But that was like, wait a minute. They spent $12 million and got 3 people elected to the board of a $250 billion corporation that's over a century old. Well, that feels different. Like, that feels like there's something new there. I want to understand this better. I mean, how do I help? I don't know, Steve, you probably had better thoughts on this as well.
Well, the first thought that with climate change, first off, you can't find actually a more pressing problem, right? I mean, if we don't solve this one, we're all screwed, right? But where do you go, right? There's certainly a small group of people within the organizations and management communities that are studying climate change, and it comes under topics like sustainability and corporate responsibility and so on and so forth. But if I was going to work on this problem, I would turn to trying to do collaborations with civil engineers. Now, why do I say this? When I was at Stanford, we had a civil engineering department, and I don't know whether all civil engineering departments are like the one at Stanford, but we don't have one at UCSB, so I don't have people here to collaborate with. But people in civil, if this department is large enough, tend to be worried if things like climate change, water resources, so on and so forth. And I've had civil engineers say to me, if the solutions to renewable energy were entirely technological, we could solve the problem in the next 10 years. So the civils honestly believe that in many cases, the technologies to do this stuff are there. So they say the real problems are economic, social, cultural. Now, civils, and they'll immediately tell you that they don't know much about social, cultural, political. They know more about economic issues, but they don't feel they know a lot about social, political, and so on and so forth. Now, this is where we could really play a role, right? The civils can bring knowledge of the technologies and the kind of things that actually work, and some knowledge of their economic viability. And we can bring an understanding of how to convince bodies of people to do things, about social structures that you need to understand, how to analyze a social structure so you know where you really want to intervene, and so on and so forth. So my answer would be, if you have civil engineers in your university, try to start teaming up with the civils. The odds are you're going to probably do something really interesting and different and that's going to get you published too.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Guillaume Penn, which is the best name in the world. In English, it would be Billy Bread.
Exactly. When I was a PhD student, I was an aspiring villain, but now I'm Dr. Payne, so I'm actually a villain, ready for the Marvel franchise. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Steve and Jerry, for your insights today. My question is about tackling important phenomena, a topic you've both addressed today, and having having to repackage these phenomena or these topics every 20 years or so. So I'll take a quick example with environmental sustainability. It emerged, well, a long time ago, but it became related to management perhaps in the 60s and 70s. And then the ONE division at the Academy of Management was created in the 90s. And so it became organization and the environment. And then in the 2010s, we had grand challenges, and top journals published special issues on grand challenges. So my question to you today is repackaging or reframing important problems a valid way to keep addressing important problems even when the fad has passed? And should we have to? And what is your advice on this topic? Thank you.
I see that Ron Bird is left, which is unfortunate because one of the things that he emphasizes is basically all of the ideas are already out there in the world. We just sort of grab them and mash them up again in a new format, but there's absolutely nothing new in the world. It's just, it's new to me, or I translate it from one context to another and then maybe mash it up with something else. So it seems almost like, what's that Nietzsche thing about the eternal recurrence? that this seems true in academia, that either we've got sort of a pendulum swing where we keep going back over the same ground, or that we just, our short attention span means we can only think about 3 things at once. And so things go off the table and on the table, but like infants, we don't have this sense of object permanence. And so things appear new because we forgot that they existed before. I'm not sure that's actually getting at your question, but it does. I think your diagnosis is right, like that we revisit many of the same problems over and over again. Luckily, none of our students have the patience to read anything more than 3 years old, so everything seems new to them.
Well, I don't have really anything insightful to say, except to say, if you, Mark Knopfler encapsulated it, right? In the song Industrial Disease, there's a line that says, and sociologists invent words that mean industrial disease. So, even Mark Knopfler knows what you're talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, Yaomin?
Hello, can you hear me? Thanks so much, Jerry and Steve, for the important discussion. And it's actually come at the right timing. So my name is Yaomin, and I'm probably a typical example of the young, early stage researchers mentioned in your discussion. So, and I'm indeed facing these days about, okay, so what would be the important question and research that for me, like I want to do, and also is there any truth in terms of what we're doing? So this question is like, since I was PhD first year, I would usually keep asking my supervisor, is this truth? What we found, are they really truth? And are they really important? So I always found like it's difficult to distinguish what is, or define what is really important and how to identify it. So for example, even in natural science, sometimes some basic research, we can hardly see its importance. And the second is the important and interesting, they kind of overlap. Novelty and importance, they have, like, sometimes they overlap. Some research can be novel and important. Some research can be novel, but not really that important. Some can be important, but not that really novel. So I think Jerry used the example of the food, the research of the food. So that's probably the first example was, it is important, but not that novel. It will be great if we can find a research topic or question like which is novel and also important, but it's not usually that case. And my supervisor's answers has always been like, he didn't answer me straightforwardly, and he's very honest with me, is he doesn't think there's a solid truth in what the work we are doing in management organization research or social science research. The importance is usually a negotiation between the authors and the reviewers. So that's his answer to me. But I really want to hear what you think of it. So what's your opinion and suggestions for us? So how can we identify the important questions? And the second question is related to this one is, how to work on the very micro level data and explanations without losing sight of the macro level societal trends. So how can we, for young researchers, how can we efficiently develop a full picture of the societal trends, so we can detect important questions, among the massive digital behavior traces in the internet. So that's also part of my research is also about dealing with a massive plan for data. So for example, there was one experience of me is I was analyzing the massive qualitative data on a platform, and is to see how the platform justify its change to the users. But when I'm analyzing the data, I forgot trends. The importance behind this phenomenon is that platform capitalism. The platform is going through a process of capitalism. So for me, I feel that's because it takes years for us to develop this full picture and knowledge. But for young scholars and researchers, I was wondering how can we see this kind of important trends so we can find the real important question to answer. So I hope I explain myself clearly, and I would really appreciate any suggestions for us. Thank you.
So I have a dissertation to write on this topic with 3 components, and one is about ontology, one is about seeing like a state, and one is about how do you choose the right topic. So unfortunately, so we're past time, and Ibrat, probably we should be saying anybody that needs to bolt, go for it, but we're going to hang and keep chatting until everyone disappears. I think that's the plan. So a couple of things. It is true that it's pretty hard for people sort of new in the field who maybe haven't or not sort of wildly familiar with the various aspects of business. It can be really hard to know how to choose a good problem. I think that what you're describing about using big data traces to identify aspects of economic organization is exactly the right way to approach this. So I think what I understand you are describing as your research is just where we want to end up. I'd use this analogy that in the 20th century, we lived in a world of NBA basketball games. So if you want to look up an NBA game, like how many people played, oh, you might want to mute. If you wanted to know all about all the National Basketball Association games played in March 2022, you could do that. You could look up every player and how long they played and what the score was and who won, and all of the details are captured in the record, and we know exactly how many games were played and what the wins and losses were. And we've got a structure in place to be able to study that. We could run regressions on that world. But imagine you wanted to study pickup basketball games where people go to their local park or playground, and whoever happens to be there, they organize a game and they play, and there aren't really stable teams and people come and go. We are certain that those games are going on all across the country, all around the world every day, and we don't have a trace of that. So we know what's going on, but we don't have anything to count, and we don't really have a mechanism to get at this organization. I think there may be ways, and possibly this is what you're up to use big data to better get at the kinds of organizing rather than formal organizations that's going on in the economy today. So a crazy thing that I have to share because I want to make Steve plots. TikTok, which is a popular platform for sharing videos, is now opening a virtual restaurant chain where foods that go viral on their platform, they curate a menu, and then you can order it on TikTok. It goes to a ghost kitchen and then is delivered by DoorDash to your front porch. So this is insane. Like what is the firm? It's a lot of independent contractors and ghost kitchens, and then this video platform that is now suddenly a restaurant curating dishes. It sort of violates our understanding of like, what is a restaurant and what is food even, and who made up that menu? So we don't really have the tools to get at that very well. There's not a boundary around it or a thing to count. So maybe what you're up to, sort of a big data method, might better help us characterize the sort of permeable boundaries around forms of economic organization that don't map onto a traditional firm. It's not exactly a make or buy question. It's more like if I had all of the Zoom login data on who was on every meeting over the last 2 years, I could probably come up with a pretty dope map of economic organization and interactions. And it would not look like organizations as blobs like land masses. It would have a very different structure to it, but it would cause me to try to come up with a better ontology of economic organization. And then there's sort of a more existential question. Sorry for the rant, Steve, but the coffee kicked in. We talk about organizations as if they were these objects that exist out there in the world and we can count them up and they have boundaries. But like, imagine we were the science of diesel trucks. That would seem insane on its face because diesel trucks are obviously human constructs with the purpose of trying to accomplish something, to deliver things from one place to another. And we don't run around counting up diesel trucks and doing regressions on engine displacement and mileage. I mean, you could, but you wouldn't think that's science exactly. You wouldn't think I'm going to come up with the timeless truths about diesel trucks, because there is no such thing. They're a humanly constructed artifact that you can run regressions on them, and you can do fixed effects, and you compare Chevys and Fords, and you can find things to weigh, and then the CEO is like the driver, and the fuel is like sort of revenues. Who knows? You could sort of map our whole field onto this, but you'd immediately say, well, that's dumb. It is just not the kind of thing that is susceptible to eternal truths. It is not that kind of thing. A science of diesel trucks would be silly on its face. We don't act that way about organization science, but I don't know. Steve, can you maybe attack everything I just say and fix the field for us?
Well, I do agree with you that if you could get all the data on the Zoom meetings, you'd have a very good basis for trying to infer some important underlying categories for what economic activity looks like today. I totally think that's right. It's too bad that I think Ron Burt's gone. This is the kind of thing that I would think Ron would have something to say about on that particular piece of research. But the larger question of, how do you decide what's important? And you've noted that they're important to novel problems. They're novel but unimportant problems, and then there are important problems that aren't novel, as you put it, right? And I totally agree with that. So how do you find an important problem? It sort of depends on the space that you want to operate in. What are you interested in? What's your space? What arena of empirical inquiry turns you on? Now, there are some areas where there actually is accumulations of knowledge, and there are issues within that accumulation, or they're stumbling blocks within that accumulation that need to be worked out. This is actually quite common in natural science and biology. I think the population ecologists think this is what they've been doing for quite a number of years. And if you're in that kind of space, then the important problems are going to be defined by the kind of empirical and conceptual or theoretical blockages that exist within that stream of thought. Now, if you're a sociologist or an economist or someone who's interested in more macro social phenomenon, there's tons of them out there. Climate change is one. Changing nature of employment relations is the one that I'm mostly interested in, because that's where I thought, first off, I've always been interested in employment and work. And secondly, that's my invisible college. That's who, when I write, that's who the core of the people I'm writing for are those people, right? So what core, what invisible college is yours, right? And once you know that, then you can begin to say, okay, what are the important problems, either within our knowledge base or in the larger social world within this kind of realm that I like to operate in, can I attack? My 2 cents.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Also, just to your point, Steve, I was wondering, is like, so for I know we know poverty, employment, these are important questions. It's already like we have consensus. But what if some phenomena we don't really see its importance at the moment? For example, climate change and COVID, nobody sees its importance in probably years ago, but now so practitioners or the problems turn out, then everybody found it's important and everybody jumping to study it. So I don't know if there's something common among in the social science area. How does it? Can social sciences or organization studies or management be more predictive on the importance of a topic and question? Or can we just wait things to happen and then know its importance?
COVID feels like a pretty apt one to look at. So as I posted here, go to ssrn.com and look up COVID papers. There is like tens of thousands of papers. I mean, COVID just, everyone in the world decided all at once, like, drop your tools, as Carl Whitewood has said, drop what you're doing. This matters right now and help us figure this stuff out. And I think, thousands of dissertations might be written about how was knowledge organized, like mobilized, organized, sorted through? How do we know the good stuff from the bad stuff? Because like we need answers right now. We do not have time for peer review. How do people make those judgments when there's 100 papers on ssrn.com on your topic? Both on medicine, but also in social science. There was so much work out there that everybody overnight became an expert on COVID, but also started publishing things with the express intent of informing decisions, policy, business actions. So feels like there might be something interesting there. Steve? Sure.
No, I agree. Important problems. It's hard. You have to be a pretty good soothsayer to figure out what's an important problem before it actually occurs. I don't know whether that's exactly what you were asking us, but that's what I heard, right? It's hard to do, but I don't think there's any dearth of problems that actually appear either slowly or quickly like COVID for us to worry about things that there aren't enough important things for us to study. Okay, so it's like we're well 20 minutes past the end time. So let me ask if anybody else has any burning questions they want to ask us.
Samuel, I think.
Yes, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Stephen, for your insightful discussion. A quick question: say if a person is he's concerned less with the tenure and more with doing some useful, so to speak, research, and then is there a way? I mean, any suggestions? Let's say he has not landed a job in the typical tenure track position. Is there a way? So specifically, let me put my question in a more concrete. If I'm interested, let's say, in climate change, and now the first, according to some research, the first cause of this climate change is the family animal farming. Terry, probably you have some idea of that, right? Because but anyway, to cut it, long story short. So, but if a few researchers are doing research in that area, if I'm doing that, it's like I don't know. So my question, long story short, is it possible, just to do this kind of, research, offbeat, research?
Well, look, farming is a business, right? And now most people in management schools don't give a damn about farming and wouldn't speak to farmers, but farming is a business. And if you're interested, right, in controlling methane emissions or whatever, right, from manure, then I say go for it, because there are people out there who want to hear what you have to say. Now, you may not be publishing this unless you're probably not going to publish a lot of stuff at ASQ. I just don't think there's a lot of readers at ASQ that are going to read particularly technical papers on how to deal with animal manure, right? But there are tons of agricultural journals and agricultural management journals that we just don't pay any attention to because business schools don't give a damn about farming. So I would say, why can't you do this? You just have to kind of break free of the notion that what you have to do has to look like what everybody else around you is doing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Maybe we could just finish with one more question, if that's okay, Steve and Jerry. And the question to you, it's on the topic of today's conversation, and you called on people to do more useful research, and you even give a bit of a roadmap for that as well. Just to put the question back to you on that, if you were to hire a newly minted doctor, well, not doctor, but someone with a degree now, with a PhD, what would you be looking for? What would be important for you to consider? If it's not Google Scholar citations, if it's not theoretical contribution, what would you be looking for?
I want someone who's going to be able to teach me about all this new stuff that's going on in the world that is eluding me. I feel like the labor markets now look so different. Like Steve was writing about the gig economy in the late 90s, like he was way ahead of the curve on this stuff, but it looks so radically different now. I'd say, ethnographers who are understanding the on-the-ground experience of the gig economy, or working in precarious times, or work from home, that feels pretty right. I would say our questioner about sort of, can we use big data to get at the organization of the economy? I would love to see something like that. I think Steve is right about engineers. They can be pretty helpful. But this is going to sound horrifying, but you should know what an API is. I think that doctoral programs are like 20 years behind in terms of teaching Python and SQL and Tableau. And it's not, even if you're an ethnographer, you still need to know how to code. You are not going to understand the world that we were operating in if you don't know how code works and how the web works and what an API is. So I want someone who's fully versed in the stuff that that is underlying the transition we're living through now. So yeah, so this is like someone who is SQL Python coder, who's also an ethnographer, but also a civil engineer, and can do really good network analysis on understructured data from Zoom meetings. That's the person I'm looking for. Steve?
Well, you don't have to have so many. You don't have to have so many specialties, but when I'm looking for people, I'm looking for people that are attacking interesting, important problems in a serious empirical way, right? So the last couple junior peoples we hired, one guy, Matt Bean, studies robotics and the impact of robotics on the workplace. Another young person, Jessica Santana, is a big data person, and she's interested in the kinds of issues that Jerry just talked about, but issues within the areas of entrepreneurship. But I think that any department at this point in time, the way things are going, would be well served by having one or two people who can do big data analytics, can teach other people how to do big data analytics, and also realize what the limitations of those tools are, right? Because you cannot answer every question with big data analysis. So anyway, that's what I would say.